I want you to imagine just for a second a massive state-of-the-art factory.
Okay, a factory.
Right. So the master blueprint is perfectly drafted, the assembly lines are fully built, and, all the raw materials are just sitting there waiting on the docks.
Hmm.
But the manager, who is supposed to carry the daily instructions from the office down to the factory floor, they just don't show up to work.
I see where this is going.
Yeah, so the machines can technically run, but without those precise localized instructions, the whole operation basically grinds to a halt.
It's a great analogy because for a child with PURA syndrome, that missing manager isn't a person, it's a microscopic protein.
Exactly. And the factory is their developing brain.
Welcome to this deep dive for the PURA Syndrome podcast. If you are listening to us right now, you are likely a parent or a carer or just a fierce advocate for a child diagnosed with PURA syndrome.
And we know you didn't apply for this job. You were handed a piece of paper with 4 letters on it and told to somehow chart a course for your child's entire life, which is incredibly daunting. So our mission today is to give you the translation manual for that new reality. We're going to decode a huge stack of medical literature, clinical guidelines, foundation resources, all of it.
We want to break down what's fundamentally happening at the DNA level, why the neonatal period is so intense, the developmental path, and honestly, this is huge, the unprecedented research pipeline.
Yeah, there is so much hope in the research right now, but we also want to explicitly focus on something that often gets overshadowed: the siblings.
Right, because a rare disease diagnosis doesn't happen in a vacuum. It alters the entire family ecosystem.
Totally. How do you make sure your other children don't feel left behind when you are just consumed by therapy schedules and medical crises? We are going to make sibling support balancing that attention a core pillar of our discussion today.
Which is so needed. Navigating PURA means supporting the whole family unit. But to really ground this deep dive, we have to start with the timeline.
Yeah, let's talk about the timeline, because PURA syndrome is undeniably rare. The estimated incidence is about 1 in a million.
Right, 1 in a million. But the speed at which science is mapping this is staggering. I mean, before the year 2014, PURA syndrome basically did not exist in the medical literature.
Wait, 2014? That is wild to think about. That's practically yesterday in medical terms.
It really is.
So if a child had these exact symptoms in, 2010, what were parents even told?
They were just given misdiagnoses. They were handed these broad umbrella terms, severe cerebral palsy or global developmental delay.
Right, or things that look similar in babies.
Exactly, like spinal muscular atrophy or Prader-Willi syndrome. It wasn't until 2014 that the first 15 children were definitively identified with this specific genetic change.
Just 15 kids a decade ago. And now, if you look at the global patient registry today, there are over 706 confirmed cases across 60 different countries.
Which is a massive leap. And that doesn't just happen because doctors suddenly got better at looking at patients. The actual technology used to search human DNA fundamentally changed.
You're talking about whole exome sequencing, or WES, right?
Exactly. WES was a total revolution. Historically, genetic testing was agonizingly slow. You had to have a strong suspicion of a specific flaw, and you'd only test for that.
So it was like looking for a typo by reading a giant library of books line by line.
Yes. But the exome sequencing approach changes the search completely. The human genome is the whole library, right? But about 99% of it is just structural scaffolding or blank pages.
Just the binding of the books.
Right. The exome is the 1% that actually contains the recipes for making proteins. WES let scientists stop reading the blank pages and just feed all the vital recipes into a massive search engine.
And labs started using these highly advanced software platforms like Illumina's Dragon v3.2.8 to rapidly scan that 1% against a reference genome.
They were looking for microscopic anomalies. And in these early patients, they found a consistent, incredibly tiny error on chromosome 5.
At a very specific address, locus 5q31.3.
That's the physical location of the PURA gene. And structurally, it's a bit unusual. It's a single exon gene.
Meaning what, exactly?
It means its genetic code isn't broken up by non-coding segments like most genes. It's just one continuous set of instructions. And its only job is to produce a protein called PUR-alpha.
Okay, so let's bring this back to that factory blueprint analogy from the start.
Let's do it.
Normally, you inherit 2 sets of blueprints, right? One from mom, one from dad. So you have 2 factory managers, 2 sets of pure alpha proteins on the floor, making sure everything runs.
Right. But in PURA syndrome, the condition is driven by something called haploinsufficiency.
Which basically means half is not enough.
Exactly. One of those 2 inherited copies of the gene has a mutation, maybe a missing sequence or a scrambled code. So that single copy doesn't produce working pure alpha.
The factory only has one working manager.
Yes. And while that one manager is working overtime, the biological demand of building a human nervous system is just too massive for them to handle alone.
To really get why the factory is failing, we have to look at what pure alpha actually does. The literature describes it as this highly conserved, multifunctional protein.
It's essentially a molecular transport vehicle, and its physical structure dictates how it works.
Okay, break down the structure for us.
Well, the most vital feature is its 3 ones, per repeats. These are specialized sequences of amino acids that fold into a shape that acts like a pair of molecular hands.
Hands that grab onto what?
DNA and RNA.
So it's literally holding the instruction manuals.
Yes. Think about neurons in the brain. They are incredibly long cells. The nucleus, where the DNA lives, might be really far away from the end of the dendrite where a synapse is trying to connect.
Right.
Pure alpha acts as the transport. It grabs onto mRNA, the messenger copy of the instructions, and physically carries it down the tracks of the neuron to where a local protein needs to be built.
Oh, wow. So if you rely on a single overworked manager, that transport system is heavily delayed.
Deeply delayed. The localized instructions never reach the assembly line at the end of the neuron, and the synaptic connection struggles to form.
And the sources point out a specific hotspot for these mutations, right? The most common one is called P233del.
Yeah, that translates to the deletion of a single amino acid.
Phenylalanine.
Just one single missing link in a chain of 322 amino acids.
Exactly. But because of where that specific amino acid sits, its absence entirely changes how the protein's third repeat folds.
So going back to the analogy, the factory manager shows up to work, but their hands are tied behind their back.
That's a perfect way to picture it. The molecular hands cannot grip the mRNA. The protein is there, but functionally useless.
Now, for you parents listening to this structural breakdown, we know there's a heavy psychological question that usually pops up right about now.
Of course. Did I pass this on? Is this my fault? Question.
We need to be absolutely clear on the clinical data here. In nearly every single documented case, this genetic alteration is de novo.
De novo, meaning it is completely random. It occurs spontaneously during the earliest moments of cell division.
So it's a biological copy error.
Yes. It's not an inherited trait in the traditional sense. It's nothing you ate, no environmental exposure, nothing you could have prevented, which is so important to internalize. And because it's a random typo, it also means the recurrence risk for future pregnancies is incredibly low.
Statistically, less than 1%. Medical geneticists will note a microscopic theoretical risk called parental germline mosaicism.
Right, where a tiny cluster of cells in a parent's reproductive organs carries the mutation, even though the rest of their body doesn't.
Exactly. But practically speaking, the risk of having a second child with PURA syndrome is exceedingly rare.
Okay, so because this per-alpha protein is so critical for building the brain early on, the effects are not subtle. They hit the very moment the child is born.
They really do. The first year of life is universally described by families as a terrifying crisis in the NICU.
Clinically, doctors are looking at a specific neonatal triad, right? Severe hypotonia, respiratory insufficiency, and dysphagia, or feeding difficulties.
That's the core triad.
I want to push back on how doctors spot this early on, though. If a neurologist walks through NICU, they see dozens of babies with low muscle tone, the classic floppy baby. How do they separate a child with PRRA from a child with a severe muscle-wasting disease like SMA?
That is the million-dollar clinical question. And the primary clue lies in the reflexes. Hypotonia just means low muscle tone. The muscles lack resting tension.
Okay.
In a peripheral nerve disease like SMA, the physical connection between the spinal cord and the muscle is actually degenerating. The muscle wastes away.
Yeah.
But in PURA syndrome, the muscles and the peripheral nerves are fundamentally healthy.
So if a doctor does a reflex test like tapping the knee with a little hammer, what happens?
The leg kicks. The deep tendon reflexes are usually completely retained in PURA infants.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. A reflex arc is a closed loop. The tap sends a signal to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord instantly says contract. It doesn't need the brain's input, so the kick proves the hardware in the limbs works fine.
The hardware works, but the central nervous system is dropping the call.
Precisely. The brain just isn't sending the descending signals down to the muscles to maintain their resting tone.
And that central disconnect causes the whole triad. It's not just the arms and legs that are floppy, it's the airway and the throat. Over 50% of infants with PURA suffer from severe apnea.
Yes, and this respiratory insufficiency shows up in two different ways mechanically. The first is obstructive apnea.
Because the throat muscles are so relaxed.
Right. Gravity just pulls the tissue down when the baby sleeps, physically blocking the air. But the second type is central apnea, and that is much more dangerous.
This is where the brainstem itself, the autopilot, just forgets to send the impulse to breathe.
Cur alpha is heavily utilized in the brainstem's respiratory centers. Without it, the respiratory drive is super sluggish. The baby might take shallow breaths or just pause breathing for terrifyingly long seconds.
Which requires massive medical intervention, CPAP machines, supplemental oxygen, or even surgical tracheostomies to bypass the upper airway.
And alongside all of this, there's profound temperature instability, hypothermia.
The body's internal thermostat is just struggling.
Yeah, the hypothalamus. These infants can't reliably regulate their core temperature. Plus, they present with hypersomnolence. They are excessively sleepy, which makes them incredibly difficult to wake up for feeding.
Which brings us to the third part of the triad, the feeding crisis. Eating is a really complex ballet.
It's called the suck, swallow, breathe sequence. It takes dozens of muscles in the face and throat to pull liquid in, seal off the airway, and push fluid down to the stomach all while still breathing.
But if the brain isn't sending reliable signals, that coordination completely shatters.
Dysphagia, or impaired swallowing, is almost universal here. If they try to eat, fluid can easily slip past the epiglottis and enter the lungs.
Aspiration, which leads to severe bacterial pneumonia.
Exactly. To circumvent this, the clinical path almost always involves bypassing the mouth entirely early on. Families rely on nasogastric or NG tubes threaded down the nose.
And for long-term support, they usually transition to a G-tube, surgically placed directly into the stomach.
It's a life-saving intervention.
Yeah.
It ensures the child gets the exact calories needed for brain growth without the constant threat of pneumonia.
But inside all of this neonatal trauma, the clinical data provides this massive, reassuring pivot point.
It does.
The respiratory instability, those terrifying apneas that keep you staring at monitors all night, they usually don't last forever.
This is one of the most fascinating aspects of PURA. As the brain matures over the first 12 to 18 months, it establishes neurological workarounds. The central apneas frequently show drastic improvement or even resolve entirely after age 1.
Surviving that first year completely shifts the focus. You go from critical survival to neurodevelopment. You're trying to bridge the gap between the child's inner world and their physical environment.
Which requires a huge shift in how we categorize the condition. PURA syndrome is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It is strictly not a neurodegenerative disorder.
The psychological weight of that distinction is massive. Degenerative means a ticking clock. It means losing skills as brain tissue dies.
But PURA syndrome does not destroy existing neural architecture. Children with PURA are always on a forward trajectory. They don't typically lose milestones.
They just acquire them on a very unique, elongated timeline because their neural networks are building themselves with half the usual transport staff.
Exactly. Now, independent walking is not a guaranteed milestone. The chronic central hypotonia makes fighting gravity a lifelong challenge.
But for those who do walk, when does it happen?
Generally between the ages of 3 and 10. And mechanically, it looks different. It manifests as a wide-based, unsteady gait.
To create a larger center of gravity.
Right, to avoid falling, because their core muscles struggle to maintain rigid posture.
I found a quote in the source material from a family that perfectly captures this physical resilience. It's about a 7-year-old girl named Sarah.
Oh, the Sarah quote. I love that one.
Yeah, her parents wrote, "We were told Sarah may never walk, but she thought otherwise. Through hard work, she is learning to use a supportive walker to take steps. She has an incredible outlook on life, the most infectious giggle, and a determination to do whatever she sets her mind to."
That vignette is just perfect. It illustrates the reality of the motor journey. It takes years of intense physical therapy and customized orthotics, but their intrinsic drive to explore is fiercely intact.
However, as they try to explore, they run into maybe the most frustrating aspect of the syndrome: the barrier between what they understand and what they can express.
The receptive-expressive discrepancy. This is a hallmark clinical feature. The overwhelming majority of these individuals are non-speaking or nonverbal.
But it's not because they don't understand language.
Oh, exactly the opposite. Their receptive language, their ability to process and comprehend spoken words, is incredibly strong. The cognitive architecture to understand a complex sentence is there.
The failure is in the motor execution.
Yes. The brain cannot coordinate the highly complex, rapid-fire muscle movements of the vocal cords, tongue, and lips required to produce speech.
So their inner life is incredibly rich. They understand the tone of a room, they get the family jokes, they know what they want to say, but they are trapped behind physical hardware that won't broadcast it.
Which is why introducing augmentative and alternative communication AAC at a very early age is not optional. It's the primary bridge to their autonomy.
And there's a tiered approach to AAC depending on their motor control. It starts with low-tech options.
Right. If the child has enough fine motor control, manual signing systems like keyword sign work really well, or physical symbol boards like PODD communication books where they point to pictures to build sentences.
But the clinical guidelines highlight high-tech solutions as real game changers, tablets with speech-generating software. And for those who can't physically point, eye gaze technology.
The mechanics of eye gaze tech are profoundly liberating. An infrared camera tracks the microscopic movements of the user's pupils. By just resting their gaze on an icon for a fraction of a second, they can select words and have the computer speak for them.
It totally bypasses the need for limb control. There's another parent quote about a 14-year-old boy named Aiden. They said, "I have learned from Aiden that being nonverbal is not the same thing as not being able to communicate. We've learned new ways of being in the world with Aiden so that he can live life more fully."
That is the essence of managing a neurodevelopmental disorder. The goal isn't to force the child into a standard mold. It's to alter the environment so the child can exert their agency.
As families get into the rhythm of these therapies, PT, speech therapy, there's often this acute medical hurdle that suddenly hits in childhood. Just as breathing stabilizes, the brain's electrical activity begins to misfire.
The neurological burden is immense. Epilepsy is diagnosed in over 50% of patients, usually starting between ages 2 and 5.
And it's not just the dramatic, full-body convulsions people picture.
Right. No, it covers a vast spectrum. Many families first notice myoclonic jerks. Mechanically, these are sudden, involuntary bursts of electrical activity that cause a quick muscle contraction.
Like a violent hiccup or a sudden jolt.
Exactly. And they can happen in clusters, hundreds of times a day. It severely disrupts their ability to learn or sleep. And because of the genetics, this epilepsy frequently progresses into much more severe territories.
Like generalized tonic-clonic seizures.
Right, involving a complete loss of consciousness and convulsions. Or even Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which is an aggressive epileptic encephalopathy with multiple seizure types and severe developmental stalling.
Now, if a patient has a brain tumor causing seizures, a surgeon can sometimes just remove that tiny patch of tissue. Why isn't that an option for a child with PURA?
Because of haploinsufficiency. Every single neuron was built using the same defective blueprint. There is no healthy lobe and damaged lobe. The entire brain has a globally lowered threshold for misfiring. The spark could ignite anywhere.
So surgery is out. That leaves pharmaceutical management. But the sources describe PURA-related epilepsy as highly refractory.
Resistant, yeah. Families cycle through cocktails of powerful meds, dealing with heavy sedative side effects, often without getting total seizure control.
So neurologists have to look at non-pharmacological interventions. The literature highlights two specific ones. First, vagus nerve stimulation, or VNS. How does stimulating a nerve in the neck calm the brain?
Well, the vagus nerve is this massive biological superhighway running from the abdomen through the chest directly into the brainstem. A VNS device is like a little pacemaker implanted under the skin with a wire wrapped around that nerve.
Okay.
It delivers regular, mild electrical pulses up the highway into the brain. These rhythmic pulses act like a metronome, altering the brain's electrical environment and making it much harder for chaotic seizure activity to synchronize.
That's incredible. And the second intervention is dietary, the ketogenic diet. We hear about keto as a weight loss thing, but it was originally a neurological treatment. Why does a high-fat, low-carb diet stop seizures?
It fundamentally changes the brain's fuel source. Normally, the brain burns glucose from carbs. When you restrict carbs, the liver breaks fats into molecules called ketones.
And burning ketones changes the brain.
Yes. When the brain burns ketones, it alters the chemical environment of the synapses. It increases the production of GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It basically tells excited neurons to calm down.
Wow. But navigating all this is a terrifying puzzle for parents, because a child with severe hypotonia might twitch or stiffen for reasons that have nothing to do with epilepsy.
Distinguishing a seizure from a non-epileptic movement is one of the most critical challenges. They visually mimic seizures to an alarming degree.
The texts mention dystonia and dyskinesia.
Right. Those are involuntary, sustained muscle contractions caused by miscommunications in the basal ganglia. It causes twisting postures, but it's not an electrical storm.
Then there are stereotypies.
Repetitive behaviors like hand flapping or rocking. Self-soothing mechanisms, not seizures.
But the most distinct non-epileptic movement, which is actually a major diagnostic red flag, is the pathological startle response.
It's a profound neurological hypersensitivity. If a neurotypical child hears a door slam, they jump slightly. If an infant with PURA hears a sudden noise, their nervous system radically overreacts.
The whole body becomes rigid and stiff for several seconds.
Yes. And to a parent, or even an untrained doctor, a baby suddenly going completely stiff looks exactly like a tonic seizure.
So how do you tell the difference?
You have to use video EEGs. Electrodes on the scalp map the brain waves while a camera records the movement. You have to prove that the physical stiffening corresponds with an electrical storm.
If the brain waves remain calm, it's a startle response.
Exactly. And that distinction dictates the whole treatment path. Medicating a benign startle response with heavy anti-epileptic drugs is dangerous and ineffective.
Because the PUR-alpha protein is in almost every cell, management extends way beyond the skull. We have to look at multi-systemic impacts. Let's talk about the skeletal system.
It's heavily impacted, and it all comes back to Wolff's Law. Wolff's Law says that healthy bone grows denser in response to mechanical stress.
So walking, running, bearing weight.
Right, the impact signals osteoblasts to build more bone mass. But a child with severe hypotonia who spends most of their day in a wheelchair is deprived of that mechanical stress.
Without that stress, bone density plummets. Osteopenia or osteoporosis at a very young age.
Which creates a severe risk of pathological fractures. A bone might break just from being lifted awkwardly. So meticulous monitoring, vitamin D and calcium are required.
And a weak skeletal system fails to support its own structure. Nearly 48% of PURA patients develop scoliosis.
The spine is held straight by core muscles. When those are weak, gravity wins. The spine curves laterally. Over time, it compresses the chest cavity, restricting lung capacity.
That sounds like it often requires major surgery.
It frequently necessitates spinal fusion surgeries with metal rods to force the spine straight.
Moving inward, this lack of muscle tone also wreaks havoc on the GI tract. Chronic severe constipation is almost universal.
The intestines rely on rhythmic muscular contractions, peristalsis, to push waste out. Intestinal hypotonia means the gut is severely sluggish.
The sources mention daily reliance on osmotic laxatives. How do they work if the intestine is floppy?
Well, the stool sits in the colon, gets hard, and the muscles can't push it. Osmotic laxatives work chemically. They draw water from the surrounding tissues back into the colon via osmosis.
It floods the intestines.
Exactly, softening the stool dramatically so simple gravity can do the work the muscles cannot.
The endocrine system is also impacted. The data shows pituitary gland dysfunction.
The anterior pituitary is the master regulator of hormones. When it malfunctions, it disrupts puberty timing. We see precocious puberty starting aggressively early or delayed puberty requiring hormone therapy.
We also have to touch on ophthalmology, because if a child relies on eye gaze tech, their vision is literally their voice.
Visual impairments are very prevalent. The most common is strabismus, a misalignment of the eyes. The tiny extraocular muscles suffer from the same hypotonia.
So if the eyes cross or drift independently, the infrared camera on the AAC device can't track the pupils accurately.
Right. Correcting strabismus through surgery or using prescription glasses for severe short-sightedness isn't just about visual acuity. It is about preserving their fundamental ability to interface with the world.
Which brings us to a massive blaring siren in the clinical literature. We've just discussed spinal fusions, G-tubes, strabismus repairs. All of these require general anesthesia.
Yes, they do.
But the biological makeup of a PURA patient reacts to anesthesia in a highly dangerous way. Parents, you must memorize this part.
The orphan anesthesia guidelines for PURA syndrome are explicit. Standard anesthetic protocols can be fatal for these patients.
Why is sedation so uniquely dangerous here?
It traces back to the brainstem. It already struggles to maintain a reliable respiratory drive. General anesthetics, particularly opioids and benzodiazepines, depress the central nervous system.
And in a PURA patient, that depression easily tips them into complete respiratory arrest.
Exactly. The guidelines specifically state that the administration of opioids and benzodiazepines must be reduced by 50% compared to standard protocols.
A 50% reduction is a huge clinical shift. And the setting of the procedure is strictly regulated too. No ambulatory or day surgeries.
No exceptions. Even for a minor G-tube button change or teeth cleaning, the risk of delayed post-anesthetic apnea is too extreme.
So a full 24-hour inpatient admission post-surgery is mandatory.
Mandatory. Continuous pulse oximetry and respiratory monitoring for a full day as the drugs clear. And physically managing the airway during surgery is heavily modified.
Because of the severe hypotonia of the throat muscles.
Right. The moment they are sedated, the airway collapses. There's a critical risk of aspiration. The prophylactic use of nasopharyngeal airways, flexible tubes through the nose to stent the airway open, is highly recommended.
And don't forget the hypothalamus dysfunction. Their internal thermostat is broken.
When under anesthesia, body temperature naturally drops. For a PURA patient, this can quickly cascade into severe surgical hypothermia. Active thermoregulation is required, forced air warming blankets, pre-warmed IV fluids.
Seriously, to every caregiver listening, print out the orphan anesthesia guidelines for PURA. Hand them directly to the surgical team. Your self-advocacy here is literally life-saving.
It truly is.
Now, we've mapped out the intense medical reality of childhood, but as that first cohort diagnosed back in 2014 grows older, we are seeing adulthood take shape.
It's a testament to the fact that it's not degenerative. With intense early intervention, life expectancy extends well into the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
But adulthood brings a massive bureaucratic and medical cliff: transition planning.
The clinical advice is that transition planning must begin by age 12.
Which sounds incredibly early.
It does, but pediatric medicine is holistic. Adult medicine is heavily fragmented. You have to find a new neurologist, a new pulmonologist, all in separate clinics who may have never heard of PURA.
Plus, the profound legal shifts. When they turn 18, parents lose automatic medical authority. You have to establish adult guardianship, power of attorney, special needs trusts.
And search for adult day programs equipped to handle a nonverbal adult with complex needs.
As they grow into teenagers and adults, we also have to talk about behavioral shifts. The literature says these kids are intensely loving, highly social, very affectionate.
They absolutely want to interact. But adolescence introduces hormonal volatility, paired with a growing awareness of their physical limitations.
Which frequently manifests as rising anxiety. If you can't ask what's happening next, a sudden routine change is existentially terrifying.
Precisely. The sheer frustration of the communication barrier creates a psychological pressure cooker. This can lead to extreme sensory avoidance, panic reactions, or deeply challenging self-injurious behaviors.
Like, if an adult with PURA has a terrible toothache and their AAC device isn't nearby, biting their own hand might be the only way to signal distress.
Right, which makes consistent daily use of AAC and highly structured routines a medical necessity for behavioral stability.
This brings us to a crucial element of the family ecosystem. The intense, lifelong focus required for the PURA patient naturally pulls the household's gravity entirely toward them.
It does.
Which leaves the siblings navigating a very complex reality. And as we promised, we are focusing on balancing that attention.
The clinical literature focuses on the patient, but rare disease is a family diagnosis. The siblings of a PURA child are growing up in a highly atypical environment.
They love their brother or sister fiercely, but they're carrying a unique psychological load. They feel the vacuum when there's an emergency hospital run. They absorb the chronic anxiety of their parents.
And it breeds this complicated internal conflict. They might feel deep resentment that their school plays are secondary to medical crises.
And immediately after that resentment, a crushing sense of guilt for feeling angry at a sibling who is suffering.
Exactly. They often adopt the role of the perfect low-maintenance child because they know their parents are at maximum capacity.
So how do parents balance this attention when the medical needs are so objectively disproportionate?
Family support specialists suggest a framework, recognizing that equal time is mathematically impossible, but intentional time is vital.
Carving out highly protected, special time.
Right. It doesn't have to be a grand vacation. It can be 15 minutes a day that is fiercely guarded. No phones, no medical talk, just pure, focused engagement on the siblings' world.
It also requires creating an environment for radically honest conversations.
Parents must allow siblings to express their frustration or sadness without instantly shutting them down or making them feel guilty. Validating that their experience is hard removes the shame.
The PURA Syndrome Foundation has actively built infrastructure to support this whole ecosystem. They recognize you need a village.
For primary caregivers, they operate the POPS Network Parents of PURA Syndrome. It's a secure space to discuss the raw realities without fear of judgment. They even have grand POPS for extended family.
But crucially, they offer specific sibling outreach programs. dedicated spaces where brothers and sisters can connect with each other.
The value of peer validation is massive. When a 10-year-old realizes they aren't the only kid who knows how to silence a feeding pump alarm.
Or the only one who has to explain their sibling's AAC device to strangers at the store.
Exactly. It reduces that profound isolation. The foundation gives them a community that inherently gets it.
To the parents listening, leaning into these sibling resources isn't an admission that you're failing to balance your household. It is an act of profound care. Let the community support them.
Absolutely.
And it's this mobilization of the community that drives the final piece of our deep dive, the research pipeline. What is happening in 2025 and beyond is genuinely thrilling.
The acceleration is directly tied to the community sharing data. The Global Patient Registry, managed with the University of Southampton, and the Global Biobank, which stores biological samples donated by patients, provide the raw fuel for discovery.
You can't study a disease without the cellular material. And because families donated those cells, it led to a monumental breakthrough announced in May 2025, the JX knockout mouse model.
This is a landmark achievement. It was a joint collaboration between the Jackson Laboratory and the nonprofit Jack's Tomorrow.
Now, I know animal testing is a sensitive topic, but from a scientific standpoint, this is the bottleneck for genetic therapies. You can't test a novel gene-editing drug on a human child without proving it works in a complex biological system first.
You just can't. Prior to this, researchers studied PURA in isolated cells in a petri dish. But a brain in a dish doesn't have seizures, and it doesn't try to walk.
Right.
So researchers use CRISPR-Cas9 technology to alter the genetics of mice.
Let's break down CRISPR really quickly.
CRISPR-Cas9 is essentially programmable molecular scissors.
Yeah.
Scientists create a guide RNA that perfectly matches the PURA gene. They attach it to the Cas9 enzyme.
The scissors.
Yes. The guide navigates the genome, finds the PURA gene, and the enzyme snips it. They effectively knocked out one of the PURA alleles.
They intentionally gave the mice haploinsufficiency. They gave the mice PURA syndrome.
Yes, and the physical manifestation in the mice perfectly mirrors the severe end of the human spectrum. They exhibit profound hypotonia, severe motor deficits, and critically, the fatal epileptic seizures.
Having a living model changes everything. Researchers can now test actual interventions like viral vectors delivering healthy PURA genes and immediately see if the mouse stops having seizures.
And getting those discoveries from the mouse model into human clinical trials is undergoing a regulatory revolution. The FDA recognizes that the traditional pharmaceutical model fails rare diseases.
The traditional phase 3 trial requires thousands of patients. If there are only 706 known patients in the world, a traditional trial is statistically impossible.
Which is why the FDA's proposed plausible mechanism route for individualized therapies is a huge game changer.
How does that pathway work?
It allows regulators to look at the biology, rather than massive population statistics. If scientists can prove in the lab using patient cells and the JAX knockout mice that a gene therapy safely restores PUR-alpha function.
The FDA can grant accelerated approval.
Exactly. They can greenlight small, targeted clinical trials, drastically shortening the timeline. We're moving from managing symptoms to active genetic intervention.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. From the missing blueprint manager, the NICU apneas, the difference between degenerative and developmental.
The sheer resilience required for AAC devices, the electrical storms of epilepsy, the strict anesthesia rules, and supporting the siblings.
It is a medical labyrinth, but it's being actively mapped by brilliant clinicians and fiercely dedicated families. For you listening, we want to remind you that your child's path is wholly their own.
It will never align with standard milestone charts.
But that makes every victory infinitely more profound. A new vocalization, a step in a walker, or using a screen to communicate a thought. These are monumental triumphs.
And as we conclude, there is one final staggering biological connection found deep in the molecular research. It proves how vital these children are to the broader landscape of human medicine.
What is the connection?
We discussed how PUR-alpha binds to specific sequences in DNA and RNA. Advanced profiling recently revealed that PUR-alpha specifically targets and interacts with the exact same expanded genetic repeats that cause ALS.
Wait, Lou Gehrig's disease. The protein missing in these children is directly entangled in the mechanics of ALS.
Yes, ALS, frontotemporal dementia, and Fragile X syndrome. The cellular dysfunction caused by the lack of PUR-alpha is giving researchers a totally novel window into how these widespread neurodegenerative diseases operate at a molecular level.
So the data these families provide.
By participating in the registry, donating to biobanks, managing the daily grind, Your children aren't just seeking a cure for themselves, they hold a literal biological key.
Oh, wow.
The understanding derived from PURA syndrome could one day unlock treatments for some of the most devastating neurological diseases on the planet. Your children are not just rare disease patients. They are pioneers of a new frontier in neuroscience.